Okay. Hey, everybody. Welcome to day 5 of game theory. Um, Today we're going to be talking about strategic moves. So let's just jump into it, I guess. So what is a strategic move? So the nice textbook definition is an action taken by a player outside the defined actions of the game in order to gain a strategic advantage and increase one's payoff. In layman's terms, it's a move one makes before the game starts in order to extract some kind of gain. So, an example is, if this would get out of the way, player A and player B are playing Uno, and player A makes a threat, saying that if player B skips them, then on the next rotation, player A will use a +4 card. So everybody knows how to play Uno, right? Because I'm going to use that as the main metaphor. I guess that's not a very important question. You get the gist. Okay. I got one yes, so let's move on. Alrighty, so how do we define a strategic move? Because not everything is a strategic move. We need to define it. So first of all, strategic moves need to be observable. Example, let me define what that means first. If player B cannot see that player A has made a strategic move, then player B can't possibly react to it. So if player A makes that same threat in Japanese and player B does not speak Japanese, the threat is not observed because player B does not understand that a threat was made. Okay. And the next one is that a strategic move needs to be irreversible. Player B may suspect that player A may may do something else, and that anticipation could lead to not reacting the correct way. Basically, it's just no take backsies. You need to be committed and you need to be gung ho, I suppose. So an example is if player B thinks that player A may not actually use the +4, then the threat is meaningless, and player B will call player A's bluff. It's about you can demonstrate irreversibility either through credibility or through more obvious things. So does everybody understand that? Because those are the largest two definitions. This is a slightly more text-heavy presentation, so I'm trying to move chat around so I can actually see what's going on. All right, great. Right, so what kinds of strategic moves exist, right? So the first one is unconditional. Player A is going to do a specific strategic move, is going to use a strategic move such that they will choose a specific option no matter what player B chooses. So player A says that they will use the +4 card no matter what player B does. This is going to make player B react in a specific way. So that's example A. And then conditional is when player A says that if player B chooses Y1, then player A will choose X1, if player B chooses Y2, player A chooses X2, etc., etc. That's just a long way of saying, if you do this, I'm going to do that. If you do this, I'm going to do that, etc., etc. So player A says that they will use the +4 card only if player B skips them. So are there any strategic moves you can think of? And are they conditional or unconditional? And make sure that they're observable and irreversible as well. So I'll give you guys a bit to think about some possible strategic moves in basically any game. Maybe keep it to board games to keep it simple, or if you want to think more abstract, you can also do that. But I always like thinking about things like this in terms of board games. So I'll give you a little bit. I'll give you 2 minutes until 15 past. Let's say, I don't know. Honestly, whenever people come up with stuff, that's good. Does everybody understand what's going on? I just want to make sure that I've made myself clear. Okay, I guess that it's possible to use in sorry. So if one person swaps pawns with an opponent, I don't know. Okay, so I don't know how to play sorry, but I'm going to extrapolate based on what little I know. So, okay. So if the statement is as follows. Strategic moves, if they are unconditional, are phrased, I will do blank. And conditional statements are if A then B, if A1 then B1, if A2 then B2, if A3 then A3, etc., etc. So let me rephrase what you said in this kind of language. So if a person swaps pawn, then you will use sorry. If person does not swap pawn, then sorry will not be used. Am I understanding that correctly? Wonderful. Okay, yeah, that's a good example of a strategic move. I don't know what it does because I don't know how to play sorry, but that's a perfectly fine example. Yes. Okay, credibility. For a player to take an action due to a strategic move, it needs to be credible. Just stating that you will do something is not proof. So if you recall, irreversibility is can be both physically irreversible by doing something that is not possible to reverse, or you can use it through credibility. If your threat is credible, then people will react, as you want them to. But if the threat is not credible, they will not react in the way you want them to. So a simple discussion is called cheap talk, and cheap talk, you should ignore it completely. Cheap talk is completely reversible, right? Just saying you're going to do something is not remotely proof in game theory. Even if you have credibility, cheap talk might not be enough. But in some games, cheap talk useful for coordination. And in such games, they are said to have what is called a cheap talk equilibrium. So let's go back to credibility. So what are some ways one can demonstrate credibility in game theoretic sense or in real life? These things overlap. So I guess if you're in the middle of something, how do you demonstrate that? Okay, that's a terrible way of saying it. If you're just prove that, I'm at a loss for words. Okay, just show that if you are going to use a strategic move that you are committed to it by carrying out an action. So I assume you mean that in a repeated sense. So, and if you do, that's a good point. If you are playing a game that occurs multiple times, if you use strategic moves, if you use a strategic move saying, I'm going to do it, and then you do it, that is building credibility. So the more you say, I'm going to go with this strategic move and actually carry out the strategic move, the more credible your threat becomes. So if that's what you mean, that's a good example. Does anybody? We're not talking about breaking credibility. We're not really going to talk about credibility. Credibility with regards to strategic moves are not as good as irreversibility. So we are only going to look at irreversibility in this case. So yeah. Cheap talk equilibrium. Who remembers what this game is called? Pop quiz, not really. This is one of the things I told you that you should remember what it's called. So what is it called? I'm sure you recognize it, but I'm intrigued if you remember the name. Okay, I know the rules. Alrighty, fine. This is assurance. Yeah, this is called assurance, and we discussed this on day 3. Yeah. So if you recall, player A and player B need to choose either to play tennis or go to the coffee shop, and as long as they do the same thing, then they are both going to, net payoff. But if they do different things, then they'll net zilcho payoff. But if they both do the more preferred option, then they will get more payoff. So in this case, what are the Nash equilibria in this game? Yeah, that was a question to everybody. What are the Nash equilibria? Sorry. Exactly. Tennis, tennis, and coffee, coffee. So now that we know what the Nash equilibria are, we're going to introduce cheap talk. Now it's pretty clear which one is best for both of them. They both want tennis. So before the game starts, player A is going to text player B, or maybe call them or whatever, and say, hey, let's play tennis. It's clearly the better option that they will both agree on, and thus that becomes a cheap talk equilibrium in this case. So this, because it's good for both of them, credibility or irreversibility are not super important here. You just need to coordinate where you're going. This also works in an example where the tennis, tennis, and coffee, coffee have the same payoff. So long as they talk before and agree on where they're going, then they can still net payoff. But in that case, they would both be they would both have two Nash and two cheap talk equilibria. But in this case, because tennis is clearly better, there are two Nash but only one cheap talk equilibrium. Okay, unconditional strategic moves, otherwise known as commitments. No matter what player B does, player A will always choose the same option. If completely credible, it changes player B's scenario from a game into a decision, because when player A commits to something, player B is simply going to have to choose which one they are going to align with. So an example is, again, player A says that they will use the +4 card no matter what. So what are some examples of some unconditional strategic moves specifically? So what are some examples that are specifically unconditional and not conditional strategic moves? Yeah, I will do X no matter what is the definition. But what are some more specific examples, I guess? While saying I will checkmate you no matter what is in fact a power move, that doesn't really count as a commitment, because in that case it's simply cheap talk, right? There might be some credibility behind it, but that's not really irreversible per se. So that does technically count as a strategic move, but it's not the kind that we want. It's in the same. It's in even less of a vein than player A says that they will use a +4 card. It's based. That's just cheap talk. You can't even really back that up with credibility, really. So, any other examples? I will go to school. I think that's an okay example. If you have demonstrated before that you consistently go to school, then yeah, that's not a terrible example. Oh, and there's an also. Okay, I'm intrigued what the also is. Okay, I will sleep at one point in my life is kind of just a statement. I mean, I can't imagine. Yeah, it's an unconditional strategic move. Yeah. My thing is that I just don't see how you could use that in anything. But that's just me, I guess. It's not so much that it's not. as much as it is, I don't see the points per se. I don't really. Yeah, I guess it counts. It's not particularly useful, but it counts. Okay. Strategic moves in what? What's this game called? I'm asking you another pop quiz. What's this one called? This one you definitely should remember because I told you to remember this. Chicken. Thank you. It's chicken. So, what are the Nash equilibrium or equilibria in chicken? Do you guys remember? Or do you guys, I mean, you guys should figure it out whether you remember. Yeah, but so what are the Nash equilibria in chicken, I guess? You can either remember it or you can, solve it. I don't care which one you do. You don't need to show work or type anything in the chat box. I don't care. Just what are the Nash equilibria? Yeah, straight swerve, exactly. So these are the two Nash equilibria. It is swerve straight and straight swerve. So let's take the stance of player A for example. Player A knows that if they swerve, then player B will go straight. And if player A goes straight, player B will swerve. So they need to figure out a way in order to make a strategic move. You just phrased that in the worst way possible. Okay, they need to make a strategic move such that player B is going to go straight. Going to swerve. Pardon. So they need to figure out a way to demonstrate I am going straight and there is nothing you can do to stop me. So what are some ways, specifically in chicken, if you are in a car specifically, because that's when it usually takes place, what are some strategic moves you could do to demonstrate I'm necessarily going straight and I will not swerve? Okay, so I see one answer, and that is, so I guess remembers, yeah, there you go. Okay, the classic example is to just throw out the steering wheel. So I was planning on playing a clip from some movie that my game theory teacher taught me, but then the people at Wave told me not to play copyright clips, so I'm not going to do that. But yeah, throw out the steering wheel to demonstrate that you cannot possibly turn. It's the classic way of demonstrating I'm going to go straight. So now that player A has, so let's examine why throwing out the steering wheel is a good strategic move. So first of all, is it observable? Well, you have to throw out the steering wheel enough such that the other player notices. Maybe if you like fling it out the window and it's super obvious. If you just casually remove the steering wheel and put it in the back, they might not notice, and thus the strategic move will not be observed. Is it irreversible? Once again, you have to make it such that it is. If you just put it in the back of your car, maybe it's reversible, but even then, it's not easy to reattach a steering wheel. So this, as long as you throw the steering wheel out your car and it is noticeable, it is a good strategic move because it is both observable and irreversible. This is a good example of a unconditional strategic move because, once again, you've thrown out your steering wheel. You no longer have any options. So now player B has to make a choice. Are they going to go straight and get in a car accident or swerve and just lose a little bit of dignity? Well, they're going to go straight. So this demonstrates how one can use strategic moves, and unconditional strategic moves specifically, such that you can always, not that you can always, such that you can make the other player make a decision. Okay. If you break your brakes, then you will go straight no matter what, but you will also crash at one point. Once again, we have to remind ourselves that we have to, while there is a real life example, we are bound by the constraints of the game. So we're not really thinking about what you do afterwards. So we don't really, breaking your brakes isn't exactly great because you can still swerve, right? So we're really only interested in, are you going to turn or are you going to not turn? So speed is relatively irrelevant in this case. Okay. Any questions? Once again, I'm gonna wait until some no's appear, simply because there's way less people and thus way less questions. So nobody has any issues, right? No one's saying anything, so I'm going to move on. Okay, conditional strategic moves, otherwise known as threats and promises. So a threat is a response rule. That's what these are called if it is a conditional strategic move that leads to a bad outcome for other players if they act contrary to your interests. So player A says that they will use the +4 card only if player B skips them. A promise is a response rule that leads to good outcomes for other players if they act in a way that promotes your interest. So player A says that if player B doesn't skip them, then player A will use the color change in order to change to a color something more to player B's liking. So first of all, does everybody understand the difference between a threat and a promise? Great. I see one yes. I'm going to assume that's enough. Okay. So now, what are some examples of threats and what are some examples of promises? I'll let you guys think about that for a little bit. That's a bit dark, so I'm not going to read that out loud, but if you can make that slightly more PG, I can probably answer that more effectively. Okay. So I'm going to look at both of these and slightly rephrase them. So I will hit you if you move. So that is a good example of a threat, right? If you act contrary to my interests by moving, I'm going to whack you with a stick, thus leading to a bad outcome. Okay, so that's a good example. If you don't show up for the head count, we will punish you in prison, I guess, yeah. So once again, it's a similar idea. That's an example of a threat. If you do something that is contrary to my interests, I'm going to do something that leads to a bad outcome. If you don't do something I want, which is showing up for the head count, I'm going to punish you. So that's pretty straightforward. I will take X if you don't do Y. That's basically the really short way of describing a threat, right? So, okay. If you are good, I will give you a piece of candy. And there's a good example of a promise, right? If you do something that's in my interest, i.e., not being annoying, then I will do something that's good for you. In this case, giving you a piece of candy. So that's a good example of a promise. So we've got some threats, we've got some promises, so I'm going to move on. Okay, this is a nice thing that I stole from my game theory textbook. So this describes the US and Japan trade negotiations. So if the United States makes a threat to Japan, then Japan can either close or open their trade, right? So, and by threats, it basically means we're not going to open trade up to you guys. If the United States does not threaten Japan, then it enters into a simultaneous game in which the United States and Japan both have to decide whether to open or close their markets. If they both open their markets, then they get then it's 4-3. If United States opens and Japan closes, it's 3-4. Close, open, 2-1. Close, closes 1-2. And then if you go down to what happens if the United States does threaten Japan with an embargo, then if Japan closes, it's 1-2. And if Japan opens, then it's 4-3. So let's first examine what happens if the United States does not use a threat. So looking at this game table, what is the Nash equilibrium? I'll give you some guys some time. Let's say until, I don't know, what time is it? I don't know. At the very least 40 past to figure out this game table. We're probably going to end slightly early just because there aren't a whole lot of people. So just a heads up, I guess. So what's the Nash equilibrium there? If people are having trouble, they can also say that. My watch is like 2 minutes off, and it doesn't usually annoy me, but now it does. I see one answer. Does anybody have any other answers? I am still going to wait until maybe not 40 past. I don't know. Is anybody else working on it, or does anybody else have a solution? Two minutes. I mean, come on. So I know some people don't really like to type into the chat and would rather just watch, but you guys should also interact with the class sometimes. I'm not forcing you, but I mean. Okay. Alrighty, I guess I'll just do it now because it's basically close enough. Okay, so let's look at this game table and use best case analysis, right? I think some people are slightly confused, so let me go over it. So let's start off from the United States perspective. If Japan were to be open, the United States would rather be open because it's a payoff of 4 versus 2. So the United States, if Japan goes open, will also be open. If Japan is closed, then the United States will also still be open, right? Because it's 3 versus 1, right? So that means the United States has an open dominance. For the United States, choosing open is the dominant strategy. So now let's look at Japan. If the United States were to be open, Japan would, are Japan going to choose open or closed? I think this is the place people were confused about. So given that the United States chooses open, what is Japan going to choose? Okay, yeah. So I think that's where the error was. Yeah, it's closed because if Japan chooses open, they get a payoff of 3. But if they choose closed, they get a payoff of 4. So yeah, we can already see one overlap in the best case analysis. So we know that open closed is one Nash equilibria. But just to cover all of our bases, if the United States chooses closed, Japan will still choose closed. So Japan has the dominant strategy of remaining closed. So the Nash equilibrium in this case is the United States chooses open and Japan chooses closed. So does everybody understand why? And if not, where is, and if you don't, how can I clarify it? Yeah. So does everybody get it? And if you don't, why not? Okay, I see one yes, but I just want to make sure that everybody gets it. So I'm going to wait for one more yes. Great. Okay. That's more than one yes. So now let's consider if the United States were instead to threat, what would Japan do given that scenario? Would they close or would they open? Okay. Let's remember that. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So some people seem to be a little bit confused. So players do not care about getting a higher payoff than their opponent. They only care about their own payoff. So if the United States were to threat, yeah, they're only looking at their exclusive gain. They're not looking at what their opponents are doing. So if the United States were to threaten, if Japan were to close, they would get a payoff of 2. And if Japan were to open, they would get a payoff of 3. So Japan is going to open in this case. So now we have 2 possibilities based on what the United States is going to do, right? The United States can either go no threat and get 3-4, or they can choose to threaten and get 4-3, right? Give me a second, something is wrong, I think. Okay, nothing is wrong. Okay, so the United States is going to use a strategic, something happened, I don't know. The United States is going to clearly, okay. So in this case, the United States can choose to make a strategic move, saying that they are going to instead threaten, right? So no threat is what happens if, the United States just acts normally. But threat is what happens when the United States decides to necessarily close, right? They say, hey, our strategic move is that we are going to close. However, if you say that there is, if you guys, I don't know if this is a good example of a conditional statement on second thought. Okay. I don't know if this is actually, this isn't unconditional. Okay. Basically, the United States says, if you are going to mess with us, we are going to threaten you, in which we get a payoff, better payoff. But if you choose not to mess with us, then we will stay open. However, Japan is going to mess with them necessarily, as we saw. Japan will always remain closed. So the United States is going to instead choose to threaten them, getting the higher payoff. This isn't the best example on second thought, but my game theory textbook didn't have that many good examples. So does everybody understand how this game works? The strategic move in this case is either threatening or not threatening. So just to make myself more clear. Okay, I see one yes. Let's get another one. Remember, any questions are good because then I can explain things. And because, again, there's less people, I would rather actually get more questions because it means that I can talk more. And I mean, we're probably going to go under time no matter how many questions are asked, but I would rather not. So, okay. Alrighty. So, you might be wondering, how are we going to stop people from doing strategic moves, right? Not stop people, but how do we react to strategic moves? And how do we also stop people from using strategic moves? Well, the moral of the story is to just read Sun Tzu's Art of War a lot. So the first thing you can do is simply say, I'm going to be irrational, right? The backbone of game theory is assuming rationality so that both players can correctly guess what the other players are going to do. But if you say, I'm going to act completely wacko, right? Suddenly the other players have no idea what you're going to do. They can't make these calculations anymore because you've already admitted that you're going to be crazy. So then they're going to have to change what they're doing in order to, not accidentally, trip over themselves with their strategic move. So what are some examples you can think of being irrational in order to get some gain? Does anybody have any ideas? This one isn't super duper hard, but I mean, it is pretty difficult. Um, what really, you don't need to come up with the most nuanced answer. Um, Okay, well, if nobody has any examples of their own, let's go back to the previous example. So suppose US is saying, hey, we might make this threat. Well, before that happens, Japan might say, you know what? No. Let's just go to this. We are going to close no matter what you do, right? So because the United States knows this, and they know that they're not exactly being rational, then no, okay, let me rephrase that. It's not we're going to close no matter what you do. It's we're going to close if you threaten us, which is actually not the best course of action. So the United States, knowing this, is going to say, okay, we know that they're going to be irrational if we threaten them. So let us not threaten them so that they remain rational, and we're going to lose a little bit of payoff. So does everybody understand why that's irrational? And once again, please, any examples? Okay, I'm not seeing anything either way. So, okay, that's good. See, that's good. Please respond more. Okay, cutting off communication. So this is another example not another. I mean, obviously, we're on the slide that says counter strategic moves. Basically, if you recall the key ingredients of a strategic move, one of them is that it needs to be observable. So if somebody's saying, hey, we're going to do this, you see it, you can just say, no, I'm not going to see it. Doing this is going to basically make the opponent reconsider, because they know that you are going to act in accordance to not, their strategic move, but what the game is without the strategic move. So let's return to chicken. So we're in this, and suppose we're player A, and we're contemplating whether we're going to throw out the steering wheel in order to indicate that we're going straight. Well, let's now instead be player B. So to counter this, we can demonstrate that we will not know if they do or don't throw out their steering wheel. We can, by not making it observable. One obvious way to do this is to just close your eyes. And thus, you've demonstrated that any strategic move done by player A will not be noticed by player B. So knowing this, player A is going to think, okay, if I throw out my steering wheel, then player B will not know that I'm going straight, and thus they may also go straight, and thus we'll end up in a car wreck, which is not good. So instead of, doing that steering wheel throughout the window thing, they are just going to swerve. Okay, leaving backup plans. This one is actually pretty clear, but basically being stubborn. That's one way of doing it. That's not directly cutting off communication, but kind of demonstrating I'm going to do this. But in general, all of these can kind of be whittled down to I'm going to be stubborn. I'm going to ignore your strategic move. Yeah. Alrighty. So what are some examples of cutting off communication that you can think of? Once again, please give examples. I don't want to go that much under time. Okay, fine. If no one's going to say anything, I'll move on. Okay. Leaving backup plans. Basically, it's just if you think someone's going to make a strategic move, you should have a way to kind of weasel yourself out of there, right? So let's return to this example. So let's say that Japan knows that the United States might threaten to close their whatever. So if that's the, okay, let's say that, the United States is choosing to threaten them. So then Japan might say, okay, they're going to threaten us. Let's make sure that we can still be fine, even if we get screwed, right? So they say, okay, if we're not going to trade with the United States, maybe we can instead, be more cooperative with, say, I don't know, Canada. They probably a good trade. I mean, Vancouver is, they're a huge exporter of Asian products. But yeah, so Japan is just going to have to make sure that they will not get screwed by the United States using a strategic move. So that one is kind of, I think, the most obvious. So what are some examples of leaving backup plans that you can think of in, some game? Okay, fine. Making sure you can escape a deadly situation in a war. That's a good example. Like I said in some lesson, I don't remember which one, game theory textbooks love using war and conflict, especially the Cold War, to demonstrate their points. Making sure that you have, some way to get out of a bad situation in a war is a very good example of, stopping strategic moves. So that's a very good example. Yeah. Okay. Salami tactics. I don't really like that they're called this. I know it's obviously a metaphor. I'm not actually a huge fan of the metaphor. but I do like salami, so it's 50-50 for me. Okay, salami tactic basically just means it works for if you have if the opponent is threatening you somehow. If you do this, then we will do this. Then you are going to only kind of do it. This doesn't work so well in this kind of game, which is called, I guess I should probably describe this. This is called a discrete game in which options are just, there's only a couple of options. But in suppose price fixing, if you are, you can say, okay, we're going to set it at 1 cent, we're going to set it at 2 cents, we're going to set it at 3 cents. Instead of doing this huge game table, you instead do a graph, right? But that works slightly better in this case. So if they say, okay, if you set the price at this much, we're going to, do this. That's our threat. Well, you say, okay, we're only doing a little bit, we're not quite doing it, so you can't threaten us. Okay, now we're doing it a little bit more. You still can't threaten us because we haven't fulfilled the threat requirement. Okay, we're still doing it only a little bit more, and we're only a little bit far, and you keep on doing this until you kind of feel like the opponent's getting mad, and then you stop. The example my game theory teacher gave was that if suppose your parent says, okay, don't go. If your parent says, okay, no, you're not allowed to go in the pool, it's like you constantly kind of dipping your toes and suddenly getting more and more submerged until your parents start getting really mad at you. So, yeah. The metaphor is that it's like because you cut salami so thin, it's like cutting more and more off the salami. But because it's so thin, it's kind of hard to notice. It's like, don't eat that salami. Okay, I'm only eating 1 slice. Come on, there's plenty of salami left, and you continue doing that. Not the greatest. Yeah, not a good metaphor. Okay, so what are some examples you guys can think of? If nobody answers them, we're just going to end class. You know what? No, this time, okay, I'll make a deal. Because people clearly don't want to actually do it. Oh. Okay, I'm going to wait until somebody comes up with an example for any one of these 4 options, right? And the second somebody comes up with a good concrete example, I'm just going to say, okay, that's good enough. So if anybody has a good idea for any of these 4, that's fine by me. Just please say it. It doesn't have to be salami tactics. It can be, irrationality, cutting off communication, leaving backup plans, or salami tactics. They should really change that name, but I don't think they can. So please, just any of these will be fine. Okay, increasing anti-spy methods in a war. Okay, so I'm going to, what is it? Can you be more specific, I guess? That's a good I mean, that's probably a good example if you got more specific. So what do you mean by that, I guess? Okay, so about the anti-spy methods thing, in a game, we are going to assume that in this kind of game, in most games that have strategic moves, you assume that you can manipulate information. You can't manipulate information. You assume that all players have the same amounts of information and that everybody can understand everything that's going on. So I don't think I'm sure in some case that might be a fine example, but it may not be. Okay. When you, okay, so basically if you get caught, having your data encrypted so that they can't figure out. That's a good example of leaving a backup plan and in some way cutting off communication. But I mean, I'm gonna decide not to view that as a information thing. I think we're talking information tomorrow, so we'll leave that for next time. But let's just say that you're trying to, it's more, I guess, metaphoric and not so much a literal thing about information. Maybe you're just trying to hide, some goals, and you kind of, you know, I don't know. But leaving a back, I think that's a fine example of leaving a backup plan. So we got some good examples. So we're going to end class not actually early at all. I guess I somehow managed to draw this up for the kind of longer time. So thanks a lot for coming. Let me just